Y'all, the Selenopolis update is finally out. I've had one question more than any over the past 24 hours. There's a new feature called magic weaving. Everybody is wondering what the best school to weave into is. So I'm going to be going from wizard to wizard, every school, answering that question for both PvE and PvP and given my rationale. Keep in mind, this is an early analysis, but hopefully this helps because magic weaving is a really powerful new mechanic. And every school has a unique way to use this. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So to answer the question first, we're going to focus on PvE. A lot of people, they PvE in this game. They're probably wondering, how do I use this new feature to my benefit? So in my opinion, the name of the game when it comes to PvE is unique buffs. You're going to want to stack buffs to increase your damage output. And the best way to do that is to either weave into Storm, which actually gives you the ability to use new blades that are both Storm and your school. Life, which gives you 1 pip auras that are pretty decent, obviously not as good as Frenzy. And I think what is probably my clear favorite for PvE purposes, I would definitely weave into Myth because you get new 1 pip traps that are just better than anything we've seen in the game. Very powerful buffs. You can potent trap this. So for PvE, I feel like the answer for every single school is definitely Storm, Life, or Myth. I think when it comes to PvE specifically, one school that's very different from all the other schools in terms of what they get for weaving into something else is Balance. A lot of their, buff utilities are based on Prism. So I think Balance is the one school that has the option of weaving into anything for PvE to unlock some new buffs, because all of them, as long as you have the damage pins for the school that you're weaving into, all of them are ways to basically just increase your damage output using another school, essentially against Balance, because you don't have a good answer as a Balance going against Balance. So Life, Myth, or Storm for every school. Balance, as long as you're using that school for damage, you could basically learn a Prism from any school. That would be my answer for PvE, but for PvP, the question gets kind of nuts. So I'm gonna go school by school. Since I'm already on the Balance, let's start with the best school for PvP in terms of Balance. I think in terms of what's gonna be meta, there's 2 big things that Balance is now gonna struggle with. I think healing is just going to be a really big issue. So I think one thing right away that's already going to benefit Balance a lot is to go into Storm so you could run Triton and do damage with it. Right, by weaving into Storm as a Balance, you get these new Pierce Jewels, and it's really good for your damage output when you're countering heals and dots. And what I particularly like about the fact that these counters give Storm buffs is that I think Balance can easily guarantee use a Storm hit with spells like Hydra. There's a lot more synergy going into Storm than most schools, but I think a very close second is Myth. Why do I say that? Because honestly, I think shields are going to be a problem for Balance, because now, since Mana Burn became PvP banned, you can't just Mana Burn away someone's pips until they cannot do a shield gambit. And if y'all are unfamiliar with what a shield gambit is, there are 11 pip spells that Death, Myth, and Ice can use, and as long as you have 4 shields on yourself, it does an obscene amount of extra damage. And since shields are very easy to put on yourself without using pips, not having Mana Burn to make them not have 11 pips to do a shield gambit, it's going to be a new weakness in Balance's toolkit. And what this new mind-blown fusion spell does, it gives you traps every single time your opponent shields. You could literally hit with Myth and get 5 traps if they have 5 shields, and you could use those traps to do tons of extra damage. The thing about going into Myth, though, is that you don't get the anti-dot and the anti-hot stuff that you already would have gotten by going into Storm. You would have to rely pretty excessively on heal counter Gearhead and Chimera to deal with dots and hots, but both of them are very valid in my opinion for PvP. Moving on to Death, I think Death is at this weird intersection in PvP where multiple really bad things can affect it. There's new hidden fuels, and that kind of takes advantage of Death's inherent weakness against trap. There's new triple dots, which are also a big concern because Death doesn't have natural dot counter. And just like Balance's weakness against shields, Balance also doesn't have a natural answer against shields. So I think there's 2 really big standouts for me. One is, weirdly enough, I think Life is very good because you can actually do a trap clear while doing life damage and turning it into stuff that Death can use very easily. So for this fusion alone, I'd say going into Life is awesome. And what I really like about Life is that you also get dot counters like Life Kingar and Earthwalker, which you can actually start doing damage with now because you can basically get Pierce Jewels for dueling into Life. While I do think Life does cover more ground, I think a very interesting spell that I'm gonna actually try out very soon, I think even dueling into fire can also be really, really good because it's one of the best shield counters that currently exists in the game, as long as you can combine a elephant with the skeletal dragon. Now, why do I think going into fire might be useful? Right now, it looks like the meta is going to shake around a lot, and a couple of schools that seem to, in my opinion, to seem very powerful with a lot of their utilities are Ice and Myth. They just seem to be very good high resist schools. They get a lot of trap identity. Ice gets a lot of like anti-aura stuff that's very useful. So I think having this fire identity might help quite a bit against schools that might become meta. And what's really nice is by going into fire, you could use Immolate. And the bottom path Immolate is a trap counter. And with all the fire pierce and all of that, this is going to be a madness to do as a death, especially because you have resist for that initial self-hit. I don't know between life and fire which one's better, but I think both of them do address some of those inbuilt weaknesses while leaving one not so addressed. So it is kind of a weird choice at the end of the day. Moving right along to fire, and I'm actually going to do something here and say that fire and Myth are so similar that they both actually have almost the same answer when it comes to their best choices for weaving. So consider this little segment what I consider the best choice for both fire and also Myth. I think what makes them so common is that they're both very weak against healing. Fire can basically hit through shields in PvP, and Myth can hit through both weaknesses and shield. And while yes, weaknesses can be a problem for fire, you can pack simple things like Evil Snowman, Dark Pact, Empower. You have ways to deal with weaknesses. So really, the one way to defend yourself that works against both fire and Myth very, very well is healing. So in my opinion, going into Storm so you can actually do damage with things like Triton and other heal counters is a great idea. For fire specifically, the fusion spell you get is a heal counter. It's unfortunately not a heal counter for Myth. It's a trap to Blade Gambit that still does quite a bit of damage. But being able to address both dots and hots while doing damage, that's a phenomenal thing for PvP on both Myth and fire. I think that's the obvious choice for both. A couple of honorable mentions. Both fire and Myth get some pretty decent blade counters if they were to go into ice. I don't think it's worth giving up the ability to address healing, which is such a big force in PvP. And I also think fire going into Myth has a very, very nice weakness counter that can actually set up Fire Scion as long as you have a weakness on you by putting 3 dots on your opponent. Also a very, very powerful spell because you can just go entirely aggro and just have an amazing answer to both weaknesses and shields at all times. Again, I'm still not sure in theory it would work as well as going into Storm. So for me, for PvP anyways, for both fire and Myth, I think Storm is the very, very clear choice. I think Storm is actually very opposite to fire and Myth because it struggles so much against both weaknesses and shields. So unlike fire and Myth, I think the best school to weave into on a Storm is something that can address those weaknesses. And since fire and Myth both specialize in it, I think quite inversely, I think the best school to weave into on a Storm is probably fire or Myth. I think because fire gives you so much power against shields, and shields are what end up normally being spammed against Storm, I honestly think for the damage on using fire anti-shields alone, that Storm into fire is really, really powerful. I'll say this, the fusion formula that you get for going into fire, it's not particularly great. It involves things that, especially Kraken, that you might not even use that much. Myth, on the other hand, gives you a very solid option through weaknesses. However, unlike fire, you don't have a cheap way like fire off to deal with shield. To me, they're both equally good answers. Now, let's say the traps take over the meta though, right? I think there might be yet an additional thing that maybe Storm can consider. And weirdly enough, that actually might be life. I'm not convinced yet that this is going to be meta because again, the fusion formula is very weird. Leviathan and Centaur, but a very cheap 4-pip answer to up to 3 traps, and you can just turn those weaknesses into damage with various other tools, right? This could be good. I would have to see if all these hidden fuels that are coming out in this update are going to really shake up PvP to be sure about this one. But I think fire and Myth are very obvious first choices in my opinion when it comes to this type of stuff. Now, ice is in a really, really weird spot right now because it actually is, it's gotten a lot of stuff, like the new shoe spell. If you guys have been watching the videos, very good against harmful auras, very good to fuse with for weaknesses and extra trap. That spell alone is going to make ice very competitive in PvP by itself, no weaving necessary, but it does have some very, very serious inbuilt weaknesses around healing and damage over time, and the school that deals with both is obviously going to be Storm. This seems to be a recurring theme for a lot of schools. Storm is a very obvious answer in PvP. Now, why do I like weaving into Storm so much? One, just like, you know, with Fire and Myth, if you use things like Triton, they'll do damage, and you might be able to use those Storm Blades a lot better than you get from countering heal. But also, you get a really, really cool damage over time counter formula. I have yet to use this. This looks very exciting to me. A whopping 840 damage. Obviously, you have to understand that this is like with Ice Pierce and Ice damage output. It's not going to be like a Storm using an 840 damage spell, but it still clears up to 2 dots for up to 2 traps, and then you can use the traps for even more damage. It could be a very easy way to keep up with things like Krampus, Fire Elf, maybe a Freet, all those types of combos. But I would also argue that this update, because Ice has so much control over both their own aura and the opponent's aura, you could always say that against dots anyways, you could just brace and try to keep a weakness on someone and just use your 85 resist to just not take damage from dots that much because of your aura control, your ability to control both your opponent's offensive aura and your defensive aura. So if you're able to get away with that, I would say the better answer to healing, which might be a real force in this meta, is actually to go into depth and get this new Primal Stampede fusion formula. This is for a simple 7 pips, an extremely powerful triple heal clear. This is as cheap as heal clears get for this much in the game right now. Only death can do this as well right now. It could make a very unwinnable matchup, which is going against a heal spammer, much more winnable, especially if you use Skeletal Pirates and Primal Stampede strategically. The issue is obviously that it opens up a very big weakness to dots that you wouldn't have going into Storm. So I think Storm is still better for Ice, but maybe going into Death could be a very solid choice as well. Now, in my opinion, the best goal to weave into on a life, it purely comes down to a numbers game. And I think the numbers game is around the fact that you just hope that you don't get another life. I think even if you pack heal counters, if someone that you're going against is a life and wants to draw out the game, this has always been the case. The game will get drawn out until it's a tie. So if you're just playing that kind of like numbers game, meaning like, you know, you're just gonna like say, okay, I'll get a life every now and then, it'll be a stalemate, whatever, then I think the best weakness to address after the inability to counter heals as a life is shields. I think if you can counter shields, you can basically deal with Myth, Ice, and also Death all the goddamn time. And I'd say based on fusion formulas alone, the new Centaurian spell is ridiculous. I want to see this in action so badly, but by combining Centaur and Minotaur, you get a quintuple shield clear, and each of those shields can be made into blades that you could use immediately to make like a Forest Lord happen or a Blade Gambit Oni happen. You also get, additionally with this, other Myth spells can actually deal with weaknesses. So if weakness spam is something that you don't like dealing with, you can actually easily just Stone Colossus and do damage with it. Right, so life weaving into Myth, I think it's gonna be ridiculously overpowered. It's weird, but if you fuse into fire, you actually also get an anti-shield, but it's not as many, but it's cheaper in pips. So I guess you could choose which one you prefer. In my opinion, I think the Myth one is so ridiculous, but I guess the fire one could also give you more utilities with, like, I don't know, overtimes. Like, the Myth one is a solid hit. This one's an overtime shield clear hit. They're both really good, but I think they're easily the clear answers. I think the other ones, I've seen some other fun fusion formulas for life. I don't think they come close to fire or Myth. Y'all, hopefully that answered y'all's questions about the best school to weave into. Keep in mind, these are just what I think are the best answers for both PvE and PvP, but it's just my perspective. I think in an ideal world, you should explore every option and see what fits for you. Let me know what y'all agree with and disagree with in the comments below. Drop a like if you enjoyed, leave a sub if you're new, and as always, if somebody hasn't told you you're awesome today, they doing something wrong. Stay awesome. See y'all soon, and yeah.